Hi everyone. I'm going to be taking you through the capital structure tutorials this block. So the first one is the chapter 14 one. Just some general advice for the course. I would recommend, like Anissa says, that you guys um, go over these tutorials and look at the answers as you're working through them. It really helps you sort of understand the content better. So even if you have to go through it a few times, that's okay. Um, it really helps solidify your understanding. But yeah, read the slides, go over the tuts, and you'll be fine. So let's start off with 14.1. So suppose the RD is 12%, RE, so they give you the cost of debt, cost of equity, the corporate tax rate, and the debt tax rate. And then they say, what is the marginal tax rate on equity income, TE, that would make an investor indifferent in terms of after-tax returns between holding equity or bonds, and then they say assume that all betas are zero. So that basically means that the risk is zero. And then basically the part about investors being indifferent between holding equity and bonds, so it basically means that they don't really care whether they're holding equity or whether they're holding bonds. So for the marginal investor, the after-tax expected returns for stocks and bonds must be the same. So we solve for TE in the following equation. So basically the cost of debt times 1 minus the tax on debt is equal to the cost of equity times 1 minus the tax rate on equity. So that's basically the equation that you are solving for. So just change the subject of formula, make TE the subject of formula, and plug in the numbers, and you'll get your answer. So it's relatively straightforward. 14.2, consider a single period binomial setting where the riskless interest rate is 0 and there are no taxes. A firm consists of a machine that will produce cash flows of 210 if the economy is good and 80 if the economy is bad. The good and bad states occur with equal risk neutral probabilities, so they have basically the same probabilities. Initially, the firm has 100 shares outstanding and debt with a face value of £50 due at the end of the period. What is the share price of the firm? So they've given us two scenarios of equal risk neutral probability. So that just tells you that the probability is 50% or 0.5 for each scenario. So the expected payoff to the equity holders, it'll be 0.5 times 210 in the one scenario minus the 50 that you pay for debt, and then plus the 0.5 times the 80 in the second scenario minus the 50, which is due to the debt holders, and that'll give you your equity value of 95. So basically the equity holders will keep whatever remains after the debt holders are paid. So the price per share will basically be that whatever is due to the equity holders divided by the number of shares. So that's how you get the 95 cents. 14.3, suppose the firm in exercise 14.2 unexpectedly announces that it will issue additional debt with the same seniority as existing debt and a face value of £50. So same seniority, that means these two debts are basically the same. If the company were to close down, the debt holders would get paid together, or there's no difference between junior and senior debt holders. Basically, these debt holders are on the same level, so they'll get treated the same. They'll receive the payments in the same way. That's basically what that means. So the firm will use the entire proceeds to repurchase some of the outstanding shares. Part A, what is the market price of the new debt? So if you remember from 14.2, in the good state, both the new debt and the existing debt are paid in full. In the bad state, debt holders share the available £80 equally because the new debt has the same seniority as the existing debt, and both the new debt and the existing debt holders are owed £50. So the new debt has a value. So in your first scenario, it'll be 0.5 times the 50 because they're receiving their full 50 back. And then in the second scenario, remember there's only 80 pounds that this company makes. So half of that 80 will go to the first debt holders and the other half will go to these new debt holders. So that's how you get the 0.5 times 40. And you basically sum that up and you'll get your £45. So that's basically the new value of your debt. Part B says, after the announcement, what will the price of the share jump to? So after the capital structure change, the expected value of the remaining equity, so it'll be 0.5 times your 210 minus your 100 in debt, plus your 0.5 times 0. So in the bad state, or the second scenario, the equity holders receive nothing because that £80 will be distributed to the debt holders only. So there's nothing left over for equity holders. So sum those two up and you'll basically end up with your £55, which is the expected value of your remaining equity. Now, to find the price of the shares, we must first find out how many shares in were repurchased at this price. So they basically solve the following equations and they tell you what these equations mean. So the first equation, which is this NS is equal to 45, it states that the new debt is used to repurchase shares. The second equation, which is 100 minus N all times S, which is equal to 55, it basically says that the value of the shares remaining equals the value of the remaining equity. So solving the two equations simultaneously, you'll get S is equal to £1 and N is equal to 45, which means that the firm uses the proceeds of the new debt to buy back 45 shares at a price of £1 per share. So that's basically part B. Part C says, show how a shareholder with 20% of the shares outstanding is better off as a result of this transaction when he or she undoes the leverage change. Okay, so you look at two scenarios in this case. So without the capital structure change, a shareholder with 20% of the outstanding shares, they'll receive the following cash flows. So we've got our two scenarios where in the one scenario you're making £80 and in the other scenario you're making £210. So this is what they would receive. The 20% times your £80 minus 50, which is the debt. So this shareholder will get £6. In the other state, they'll get 20% times 210 minus 50, they'll get £32. So if this shareholder participates in refinancing, so basically they do exactly the same thing as what the company did to change their capital structure. So the shareholder will achieve this by also selling 9 shares at £1 per share and using the proceeds to buy £9 of new debt, so which is 1/5 of the new issue. He would be left with 11 of the 55 remaining shares, which is also 1/5 of the equity. So in this case, the future cash flows after the refinancing, so in the bad state, they'll get £8, and in the good state, they'll get £32. So The cash flows are greater than or equal to the initial cash flows in both states. So by just comparing the two cash flows in initially and after the refinancing, you can see that it's better for this particular shareholder if they go through with the refinancing, because they have basically improved their future cash flows today at no cost. Okay, 14.5. As owner of 10% of ABC Industries, you have control of its capital structure decision. The current corporate tax rate is 25%. Your personal tax rate is 20%. Assume that the returns to shareholders accrue as non-taxable capital gains. ABC currently has no debt and can finance the repurchase of 10% of its outstanding shares by borrowing 100 million at the risk-free rate of 10%. The long-term government bond rate is 8%. If you hold 10% of the firm constant and buy the long-term government bonds, what is your annual after-tax gain from this transaction? So already you can see that this question is quite a lot. So I would recommend writing down what the main points are, like just in the corner of your page, just to keep note of everything that's going on. So in the absence of refinancing, the investor receives the 10% times X, which is some amount, an unknown amount of cash flows, let's say, and then times by 1 minus your 25%, which is your corporate tax rate. So that's in the absence of refinancing. Now, with corporate taxes, the investor receives the 10% times your X, which is your cash flow, minus 100 million times 10%, which is your basically your interest on the debt. And then you take that whole figure and you multiply it by 1 minus the corporate tax rate to find out what's left after taxes. And then you're going to add your 10 million times your 8%, which is the government bond that you're receiving, the government bond interest that you're receiving. And then you'll basically multiply everything out and simplify it, and you should end up with 0.05 million. And then they say that the after-tax gain is your 0.05 times 1 minus the personal tax rate, which is 0.04 million, assuming a personal tax on equity and debt are the same at 20%. So that's your final answer, 0.04 million. 14.7 is a theory question. The answer is pretty short, so you can go over that. Same with 14.9a and 14.12. The last thing I wanted to go over, I think, was the last question, which is 14.13. So ABC GmbH financed with both equity and 10 million in perpetual debt. So that means the debt continues forever. It has a pre-tax cash flow estimates for the current year as follows. So they give you 3 states with your pre-tax cash flows in a nice table. The corporate tax rate is 38.36%. The effective personal tax rate is tax rate on equity is 0%. The interest rate on perpetual debt is 10%. If the expected after-tax cash flows to the debt holders as a group are the same as the expected after-tax cash flows to the equity holders as a group, what is the personal tax rate on debt? So let's go through this. So with 10 million euros of debt at a 10% interest rate. We've got €1,000,000 in pre-tax interest, which is paid to the debt holders. So deducting this €1,000,000 from each of the three scenarios, the expected tax payoff to equity holders is this. So you'll take your probability times your pre-tax cash flow minus your interest that's due to the debt holders. So you'll do that for each scenario. So you get 0.3 times 1.5 minus 1 plus 0.5 times 2 minus 1 plus 0.2 times 4 minus 1. And you basically end up with 1.25 million euros. Now, after deducting this corporate tax rate of 38.36, the expected payoff, so you just say 1 minus 38.36% times your 1.25 million that's due to the equity holders, you'll get 0.7705 million. So from that, you deduct your personal taxes on equity, but remember, those are 0. So those two figures are the same. Hence, it says if the debt holders receive 0.7705 million in the aggregate as the equity holders do, then the debt holders' effective personal tax rate is 22.95%. How they got that was they basically just said 1 minus 0.7705 million. Sorry, 1 minus 0.7705. And that's how they got 22.95%, which is the answer. So yeah, that's the whole tutorial. If it still doesn't make sense, I would recommend going over the answers again and carefully reading the solutions and carefully reading the questions. And as you do this, as you go over it, it should make sense. Yeah, and just keep practicing questions. Thanks, guys.